So you want to buy a home, but you may have forgotten that there are closing costs associated with buying a home.
So remember, there's a down payment and then there's closing costs. All right, we're going to break down what are closing costs. Let's start with the mortgage company. You have your origination fees. Each mortgage company is going to charge you a different fee, so make sure you shop around. And you could pay points depending on the interest rate you choose. If you want to get a lower interest rate, you can pay points to do that, but that means you pay additional closing costs. You're going to pay an appraisal. You're going to pay for a credit report. Some mortgage companies charge what's called a tax service fee to make sure your taxes are being paid and verify that over time. You will pay interest. Depending on what day of the month you go to closing, you are going to pay interest up front at closing. So one thing I always tell buyers is your closing costs are going to be significantly different if you close on the first day of the month versus the last day of the month, because you're going to pay an extra month of interest and an extra month of taxes at closing by closing earlier in the month than later in the month. So they always say, oh, I should close later in the month. And I say, no, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, it's just pay now or pay later. Okay, if you close at the beginning of the month, you get about 60 days till your first payment. If you close at the end of the month, you get about 30 days till your first payment. So it's all the same. If you're going to pay 1 year of homeowner's insurance, the first year of insurance is paid up front. You're going to pay about 4 to 5 months of taxes if you live in New Jersey. Now, every state's going to be different how much taxes you pay. In Pennsylvania, you may pay 8 months of taxes. Each state has different ways they collect taxes. In New Jersey, you pay them in quarterly and only to one place. In Pennsylvania, you have a school tax, a city tax, a county tax. So 3 different places are collecting it. So it gets a lot more complex in different states. So just remember, each state's going to be a little different in the way they collect taxes, but you're going to pay 4 to up to 12 months of taxes at closing, depending on the state.
And a couple other things to mention as well. There's title insurance when you're buying a home. That's going to protect you as a buyer, making sure there's no existing liens on the property. When you purchase that home, there's clear title. You are the only owner going forward. Another thing is recording fees. So the county clerk's office is going to record that you are the new owner of that property. It is a public record. So that means you can look up online who owns what home, what price, what date they bought it, all that good stuff. And due to these recording fees, there's companies out there that are going to send you a ton of mail because they can see that I bought my home through HMA mortgage for this amount, and they try to get you to pay for things that you do not need. It's going to say very important, final notice, all this other, what's going on. At the bottom, it's always going to have a disclaimer. We are not affiliated with HMA Mortgage. So make sure you check with your loan officer, realtor, etc. to see if these things are legitimate before paying money.
So other fees you're going to have, again, New Jersey, there is a transfer tax. A lot of time the seller pays for it, but you have to look at your contract very closely because sometimes they try to ask the buyer to pay for it. In other states, the buyer and seller split it. So each state has different laws for transfer taxes. Other fees that you may pay, an attorney. If you're in North Jersey, everybody has an attorney. In South Jersey, nobody has an attorney. If you're buying in an HOA, you have to pay upfront capital contribution fees. Sometimes you pay a few months of HOA fees upfront. Again, every association is going to be a little bit different. If you're buying a house, you can get a survey. Okay, survey costs can get up there.
Another thing to be crystal clear on is the commission. Who's paying the commission on the deal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Typically and historically, the seller side is paying both real estate agents, the buy side agent and the list side agent. You want to make sure that when you're looking at homes with your realtor, you're crystal clear on who is paying the commission.
Great point. Other than that, there are minor, little small incidental charges, I would say, like water, sewer, okay? But things like that, sometimes your seller can have a credit and you may have to take care of that credit, and it can be a substantial number all of a sudden that you weren't expecting. So again, these little fees, they can add up. Just be ready that you are going to have closing costs on top of your down payment and be ready for that at closing.
When you're buying a home, there's a lot of expenses, and closing costs can quickly add up, and people aren't necessarily ready for this. So there's something called a seller concession. And what this is when you as the buyer are asking the seller to pay your closing costs for you. Now, each loan program has a different requirement for how much you can get in an assist. The biggest thing is people need to realize up front if they need a seller concession, because when you're negotiating your offer, this is the most important time to include this. Now, when you do the seller concession, the money doesn't just get to be free money. It has to come from somewhere. So the seller is taking a portion of their proceeds and giving it to you as the buyer so that you don't have to pay your closing costs today. So let's use an example. Let's say you were going to sell a home for $300,000 and you were going to ask for a $9,000 seller concession to pay your closing costs. Now, the seller is not walking away with $300,000. They're actually walking away with $291,000 because that $9,000 difference helped you as a buyer pay your closing costs. So if you realize up front that the seller wants to make $300,000 and that's what's going to get the deal done, maybe you offer $309,000, you ask for a $9,000 credit, and now the seller is walking away with $300,000. So you might be asking yourself, hey, do I have a higher monthly payment now? And the answer is yes. This is basically a way, that's legal, ethical, and by the books to finance your closing costs. If your seller doesn't agree to this, then there's no true way to finance your closing costs.
Yep. So just remember, you have your down payment, 3%, 5%, whatever that number is, plus your closing costs. You can ask the seller to pay those closing costs for you to reduce what you need at closing back down to just your down payment. But if you don't take care of that in the contract, it's going to be on you to pay both the down payment and the closing costs.
One additional thing to mention is the home has to appraise for the actual amount. So in this scenario before, the home would have to appraise for $309,000. So that's why it's so important that you have this all negotiated up front. Because as a lender, we give the appraisal company a copy of the contract. If they see that, hey, you're purchasing for $309,000 with a $9,000 seller concession, they're going to do everything they can to come in at the value we need, assuming there's comps that support it.